Our speakers today, June Bauer and Caitlin Collins, have seen firsthand how organizations that prioritize their people are more successful and become more resilient as organizations. So on to the topic of the day. I couldn't be more excited about this because this hits the heart of what a people fundamental is. We're all about to take you back into time for just a brief moment here. So in chat, why don't you help us answer this question? What user interface were you using back in 1999? And I have to say, some of you may be a little bit too young to answer this question effectively of what that is in front of you right there, but that cryptic user interface is Lotus Notes. I bring that up because I'm going to tell you a little story about feedback here. So I think we would all agree there's few trigger words in the work environment that are more stressful than feedback. And I think some of us even have scars from some of that bad feedback we've gotten in the past. Well, out of college, this was the user interface I was presented with in the email client the day out of college. And I was at one of the big 5 management consulting firms. It'll remain unnamed. And one of my first emails when I was working at Hewlett Packard as my client, I accidentally forgot to hit spell check. Well, we all think of spell check as automatically underlining the words. Well, in those days, you had to go to a drop down. And not only that, it actually spell checked the two line and told you all your emails were improperly spelled. So it was a very cryptic client. It wasn't very useful. Well, I accidentally didn't hit it. I had a spelling error. And I remember seeing the partner run over to the senior manager and yell at him. And then I saw the senior manager coming towards me, and I started to shake in my shoes. And I was pulled aside and yelled at for about 30 minutes for being sloppy and not checking my work when I sent out an email. And I remember then at the 6-month mark, my manager, who had nothing to do with any of this and didn't know anything about my work and talked to me once every, 2 to 3 months, grilled me for the entire 6-month performance review on this one email and a one spelling error. And then at the 1-year mark, he decided to bring it back up and talk about it for another 30 minutes and discuss how I seemed to have turned the corner because he hadn't heard any more complaints about me being sloppy with email. Well, I turned in my resignation note and never regretted it after that. So 2 weeks later, I resigned, and I've been happier in my career ever since. I wouldn't put that on the good feedback side of the equation, and I'm sure many of you too have had some challenges. So go ahead and click forward here. We're going to look at a survey. And I want to ask everybody about the type of feedback that they've gotten and how they feel about it. So the question here, how do you feel when you are about to receive feedback? We're talking about that moment. So are you excited about it? Are you indifferent? Are you nervous? And do you just avoid it like the plague? We'll give you a minute to answer. We need like a ticking clock there to run behind the scenes as we have the answers coming in. Do we have enough respondents to share now? Okay, 50% are excited. That's not bad. That means feedback in general may be getting better in the work world. 48% are nervous. That's probably a percentage too high. I'd probably say I'm still in that bucket from that scar over 20 plus years ago. And some of you do avoid it like the plague. Okay, well, anyways, the key point here is that none of us are trained to give good feedback. And that's a big irony because feedback is one aspect of the lifeblood that supports organizational success, right? To retain top talent and grow it, there has to be healthy feedback being shared. If you look at a study we recently did in 2023, the State Performance Enablement Report, you can download it on our website. Managers today are under more and more pressure to be able to give good feedback. And if you look at these statistics, this is from employees and managers responding, 49% of folks have considered leaving their jobs due to bad feedback. And yet these other positives below it, people would be more likely to stay if they felt they got better feedback and coaching, and managers are asking for it, says there's a silver lining here. We can do better than we are today, and that's what we're about right now. So we're going to go ahead and talk about what we're covering here. So go ahead and go forward. Giving and receiving feedback is the topic of the day, as we all know, how to train your managers and creating a sustainable culture of feedback. So with that, let's welcome June Bauer of TalkShop. She is a veteran executive in Silicon Valley. I had the pleasure of working with her back at Cisco many, many years ago. that wasn't where the email experience came from for me. And ironically, even though she is the talker in chief, June will tell you that listening is probably far more important than the talking part in giving feedback. And so welcome, June, and also welcome Caitlin Collins, our very own, to the floor. And we do this one thing at the start of every People Fundamentals. We ask for one fun fact about yourself. So June, would you like to go first?
I'd be happy to. A fun fact. Well, this morning I got up at 5 o'clock. And actually I got up at 4:30, but I was in the pool at 5 o'clock because I'm an avid swimmer and I'm on a swim team. And if you aren't there on time, you'll be yelled at by the coach. So that's how I got my day started. And it's a great way to start. I recommend it to anybody. Lots of fun.
Indoors or outdoors?
Outdoors. I live in California.
Had to ask. Caitlin.
Well, I have two fun facts to share. One just came upon me. My first one is my grandmother is coming. I live in Ohio. I'm from California, but my grandmother is moving from Arizona to Ohio to come live with me, and she's moving this weekend. So lots happening, but we're both very excited. I couldn't feel more lucky about that. My second quick one is my wonderful aunt, who is an amazing HR practitioner, is on the call with us today.
Well, welcome.
Her name's Debbie, if you'd like to say hello. So I'm putting you on the spot.
Debbie. That is a true fun fact. We have not had that happen before. So welcome. Okay, I will let the two of you take this away.
Awesome. So June and I are both really excited to be here with you. The two of us have been looking forward to this chat for a little while. I think it's safe to say, June, I'm going to speak for you, that it's one of our favorite topics for both of us. Before we dive in, we're going to set the stage a little bit, but we have a poll to run just to kind of get a sense from everyone that has joined us today on what you're looking forward to learning. We're happy to go in a lot of different directions. We've got a good agenda and a setup for us, but we'll launch that really quickly just so we can address any other questions too to get us started. So we'll give that just a moment. There's a few options included in the poll. And we do need some Jeopardy music. I'm a psychologist at heart, so I love and I'm doing this to myself, but when there's silence and people feel uncomfortable with it, but with 800 people, it's a little bit different than one-on-one, isn't it?
And you can choose as many of these as you'd like to learn about. It's not limited to one, so feel free to check as many as you want.
So let's keep, I think, just a few more moments, unless we're at a good place to go ahead and share it. Oh, there we go. Okay, so it looks like we've got some great responses. The highest one I see is how to help managers scale the capability of using feedback within an organization, and then how to be honest when giving feedback but not hurt people's feelings. All very good topics. But awesome. That is a really good response and helps us focus on that. Thank you very much, everyone, for participating. So I'm going to kick us off with a bit of Q&A from June to learn about her expertise in this area. And I think there's so much to unpack around feedback. There's personal implications and broader macro organizational implications, and we'll get to a lot of that. But I think it's important, as even as HR, we recognize how valuable it is when it's done really well. And it is a topic that's discussed quite a bit in different avenues and different forums. But I think it would be good for us to just start, June, on why you and I have decided on this topic today, and what's the value, what's the importance of what we're trying to cover with feedback.
Yeah, thanks for the question, Caitlin. And before I actually answer that question, I want to say that I am very honored and delighted to be here with Betterworks today. I've known about the company for a long time, and I've always really admired what Betterworks does. But I have to say what drew me most to wanting to do this webinar with Betterworks is that we really share the same values around feedback and helping give you the perspectives and information to empower you to be the drivers of positive change in your organization. So it is I want to say thank you to Betterworks right now. And it's really a delight to be here. So let's get back to the question you asked. And I thought a good way to approach this is to talk about what feedback should be and what feedback really shouldn't be. And so to start with, when I think about feedback, what I think about is having a conversation, right? Many times, whether we're giving it or we're getting it, we tend to think about feedback as something that we're going to give or we're going to receive. But really good feedback is about having a back and forth discussion. It's about reaching an understanding. And I have to tell you something. I heard this podcast. It was 2 days ago, so it's very fresh in my mind. I don't know if you guys listen to Hidden Brain on NPR, but if you don't, I think you'd enjoy it. It's a great podcast. And the speaker on it was Anita Williams-Woolley, who is a professor at Carnegie Mellon. And the topic was not on feedback, actually, it was on teamwork. And she's done a lot of research with her team on what makes good teams. And I was sitting there thinking, well, it's probably the leader, or it's probably the right mix of people, or, you know, a whole bunch of things. And then she came out with what she and her team have learned really makes the biggest difference on teamwork. And if you want to know more about this, I'm not going to do it justice here, but it's a very interesting podcast to listen to. The thing she said was they started to notice that teams that had more women also got better results. And so they started to look at what were the characteristics of those teams. And it wasn't really that it was women on the teams. It was that those were the teams where people really cared about the other members and really listened to the other members. It was about a team where people were concerned with their teammates and really took what their needs were into consideration as much as their own. And I found that really fascinating. And then I started to think about it and I thought, you know, that makes sense. Now, when I think back on it, I wouldn't have been able to put my finger on it. But, well, now what does this have to do with feedback? What in the world, where are you going with this? Well, I think what it has to do with feedback is that when you give or get feedback, it really needs to be, and John said it so well to open this thing up, it needs to be a give and take. And it really should be about how well you listen as well as what you say, whether you are giving the feedback or you are getting the feedback. And that means it's really about a conversation. And if you are giving the feedback, you want to structure it not as I have some feedback to give you, but rather let's talk about this, and let's talk about this in a way that is constructive. And you'll hear me say the word constructive a lot today. So it starts with what feedback is. It is a conversation. I also believe feedback needs to be given with permission. In other words, if you say to someone, I have feedback and I'm going to tell it to you, it's much less effective than asking somebody, hey, I had some thoughts about what you might be able to do to help you be even more effective. Would you like to hear what I'm thinking? If you ask someone, would you like it? They're going to feel very differently when they get it than if you say, I have something to tell you. I need to get it off my chest, right? It becomes about you. It doesn't become about really coaching and helping the other person. So I always say give feedback by getting permission. The other thing that feedback really is it is about giving people your perspective, but relative to where they're coming from. And what I mean specifically is relative to their goals and ambitions. If you can frame feedback as something that's going to help them get what they want, all of a sudden it becomes less anxiety provoking and more helpful. It's like, you understand me, you understand what I want, you understand where I want to go, and you're helping me to get where I want to go, versus I don't like the way you give feedback. I don't like the way you are a team player. I don't like, you know, whatever you're not liking about the person, or you're hearing other people complain. No. Frame it around the person you're speaking to and what they care about and what they really want. So that really feels constructive to people. It's all about helping people understand how what you're telling them can help them reach the goals that they have or their career aspirations. The other thing that feedback needs to be is timely. So I remember when I was very young, and my first big job was at Apple Computer in 1981, many, many years ago. It was amazing, and there were very few people in the company. It was a little company, like 200 people or so.
I hope you got some good stock in that, June.
I did, and I thought I did so well when I sold it for $30 a share.
There's the heart of the story for me right there.
It was a sad day when the stock went way, way up. But anyway, that aside, we didn't even have salespeople in those days. There were no Apple stores. We had these things called rep firms. And I was a product manager, and I was visiting a rep firm on the East Coast. It was in Boston specifically. And the guy who headed it up, who was very successful in making tons of money selling apples, he took us all out to lunch, his team and me. And he started giving me feedback about Apple and what we needed to do differently and how we could be more successful. And, you know, I was young. I had a great memory. So I was taking it all in. And I thought, when I get back, I'll tell people about it. He looks at me and he says to me, you know what? He said, you are not going to do anything I say. And I'm really kind of upset about that. And I thought, wow, like, where is he coming up with this? Why is he telling me this? And he said, because you haven't written anything down I've said. And I will tell you, like, okay, that was many, many years ago, but it still sticks out in my mind because that feedback was happening right when my behavior was exhibited, that I was just listening to him. I wasn't writing it down. And I thought, you know, I do have a good memory and I could say, look, I am going to do something. But it really taught me something, which is, when I'm listening to someone, I write down what I hear. And it's not as much because I'm not going to remember it. It's because it sends a message that I really am hearing what they're saying and I really do care about it. That's stuck forever because he gave it to me at the right time. It was when I was open, it was during the conversation, and it really made me think, very thought-provoking, and I would say very constructive in the end. So I think feedback also needs to be something that inspires you to rethink. Feedback, the idea of it is to reframe and rethink how you are behaving, how other people are behaving, how you might get to your goal faster, some other ways to change what you're doing so that you can be successful. And the last thing I want to say about what feedback should be is, and I think this is such a key point, it should be empowering. It should make you feel like you have choices, that decisions are yours. But too often what happens is it comes down as you're doing something wrong and you need to change. And that does not feel empowering to people. That feels like a power play. Someone's telling you to be different, maybe from who you are, and it doesn't feel good. And what you really want is a conversation where you feel like you are in control, even though you are the receiver of the feedback. And that means the person who's giving the feedback needs to think about, how do I give the feedback in a way that someone feels like it's their decision whether they accept the feedback and choose to change. Now, the consequences may be somebody could get fired if they don't accept the feedback, but it's their decision about their life. And letting people make that decision many times makes it easier to accept feedback than to reject it out of hand. So those are the things that feedback should be. And what it shouldn't be, we all know this probably, but it shouldn't feel like or be like criticism. It shouldn't be what you personally don't like about somebody. It shouldn't be one way. We talked about that. It shouldn't be unemotional. Now, we like to say that feedback should be unemotional. I mean, it should be about your behavior. But you know what? When it's two people talking about change, there is no way you can take emotion out of the conversation. There are going to be feelings, no matter how much you try not to be. And I always say, better to accept that there will be feelings and think about those feelings in advance than to try and pretend that they won't be there. And I have a great story to tell you about when I was coaching a woman who was a manager. And she'd been managing this one woman who was doing a great job. She was rocking it and she wanted to be promoted. And she told her she wanted to be promoted. She performed really well. It came to her performance review. The manager said to her, you know what, her name was Alexis, you've performed so well. We are actually going to give you a raise and you are going to become a manager yourself. You're getting promoted. Well, what did this woman, Alexis, do? I don't know if any of you have had this happen to you, but she started to cry. And she cried a lot. And she was clearly unbelievably upset about getting a promotion and getting more money. Does that seem weird? Well, to this manager who was giving her the news, she didn't know what to do. It was like, why are you crying? Why are you crying? And she said, I don't know. I feel upset. And we talked about it later. And one thing that, is interesting is, okay, here's feedback that's very positive, and yet we're getting this unbelievably emotional reaction from this woman. And what was at the heart of it was that this woman, Alexis, didn't really feel worthy of the promotion. She almost felt like an imposter. She felt a little bit ashamed, a little bit embarrassed, and maybe not deserving of getting the promotion. But the point is that there will be emotion, even if it's good news. Many times people are more afraid of success than they are of failure. And so you want to be prepared for that, and you want to accept that, whether it's you getting the feedback or giving the feedback. And many times people who give feedback, by the way, have very strong emotions. They may be irritated with a person. They may be disappointed in that person's behavior. They may be feeling anxious themselves about having to give feedback that they don't think is good. So emotion runs on both sides of the conversation. And it's something that, it is going to be emotional no matter how you cut it. So be aware of that and try to use that to make the conversation better. It's also not a single conversation. And I think so many times people think, well, I'm going to go into this, whether it's like, I'm going to do a performance review, I'm going to have one conversation and it's going to be the end of it. I'm going to get it out on the table and that's going to be that. But really great feedback happens over time. And we'll talk about this later, but it's about somebody accepting and being willing to change. And that is not an easy thing. And it very, very, very rarely happens in one conversation, right? I mean, for me, it happened with this guy, Marv, at the rep firm at Apple, but very rarely does it happen in one conversation. And so you want to think about it as a process, and a longer process than one conversation. And also, feedback is not something that is given without a lot of thought in advance. So you want to plan what you're going to say and how you're going to say it in a way that can help someone accept a new way of thinking and the potential of change. And finally, my last point is, feedback isn't just a manager and an employee. I mean, you heard my story of Marv, this guy at a rep firm. He wasn't my manager. He gave me feedback. It probably had greater impact on me than many of my managers have ever had on the feedback they've given me. But I think you can, as a person in a company, whether you're a manager or an individual, have really great feedback to give to people you work with. And likewise, they may have good feedback for you. And I think that needs to be encouraged to create a really healthy organization, and an organization that can be as good as it possibly can.
I heard, thank you so much for covering all that. I heard some really strong takeaways in some of your stories and and the way you described about what it should be, along with what it shouldn't, but making sure that feedback in and of itself is a listening activity so that we understand the perspective and context that the other person's coming from. Feedback doesn't do us any good if we're making assumptions and giving coaching advice, we'll say, to someone when there's probably a lot of information we're missing. On that, I'm going to extrapolate on that just a little bit, if we can dive into one of those points, June, if that's okay. So when feedback becomes really hard, so I hear you say that it's an emotion, there's a lot of emotions tied to this. What's some advice or what's some direction that you have in making it a positive experience? I'm going to couple that with a question. One of the questions from the audience that I see is that, which Sue wrote, that she's heard research that says that even when you ask for permission of people to be able to share feedback with them, it's not always a positive feedback experience for that person. So do you have any directions and advice on really how to lean into making this a constructive, positive experience?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. And it's not just about asking for permission. I think it's an important piece of it, but there are many things that go into being good at giving feedback, and also so underrated, but being good at receiving feedback. And I'll tell you a story. So I was coaching another woman who was going to have to give feedback to someone on her team. He was a project manager, and he wasn't doing a good job of getting feedback from his own team before he put plans together. And so the team was getting annoyed with him because he wasn't interacting enough with them. And then they weren't telling him that. They were going to the manager of the team and telling her that. So she felt like it was her responsibility to give this guy feedback. And I thought she did it incredibly well, because she went into him and she first said, "Hey, I have some thoughts about your career. Let me ask you a question." And she didn't say the word feedback, by the way. Let's just be clear. She said, and I really don't think my side comment is, I don't think feedback is a necessary word even to mention. I think it's an anxiety provoking word. But she said, I want to talk to you about your career. And she said, "I have a question for you." Well, that was, of course, first immediately, he was like, "Oh, this is great," because he had some ideas about his career. He goes, yeah, let's talk about my career. And she said, "I have some thoughts for you. Can I share them with you? Would you be interested?" He goes, yeah, please. And then she said, "Do you still want to be a manager? Because I know that was one of your goals." And he said, "Yeah, that is one of my goals, and I do." And she said, "Let me give you some thoughts then on how you can set yourself up to become a manager, maybe even sooner than you planned." And she went on to tell him about the idea of getting feedback from the team and how that works, and kind of describe the process, because he hadn't really ever thought of it that way, right? And he didn't know that it was a good idea to go get his peers' feedback before putting his plans together. And then when he heard it, he was like, "This is fantastic. I really appreciate this. I'm going to try to put this into practice right away." And so it's an idea, and it's something that, for me, starting my career as a marketing person, I learned early, which is, how do you frame information in a way that it is constructive and helpful to someone in reaching not your goals as the feedback giver, but their goals as the receiver. And so this is why I say feedback is something you want to think not just about what the feedback is you want to give, but how do you give that feedback in a way that it will be most likely the person you're giving it to wants to think about changing. Because I will tell you, most of us hate change. We do not like to change under any circumstances. Most of us. There's a few outliers. But if you went to someone and said, "You need to change," they're going to be like, "Forget it. No, I don't want to change. I'm doing it fine, and you don't know what you're talking about." And that happens so often. And I know I've been one of the people when I've gotten feedback to say that, and I've regretted it. It's not a good idea to handle a conversation that way. But but the reality is that if you do not choose to frame that and take the effort and the time to think about how you do that for this particular person, and if you do not make it a conversation, you're going to probably not achieve your goal of having someone, use the feedback. You'll achieve the goal of having gotten the feedback out there, but will the person really change? Probably not.
So what I hear you say is that this is surmised by a very common quote, maybe not so much a quote, but saying that feedback is a gift. So feedback, the intention of it is to be valuable, a value add for the person receiving it, not necessarily an emotional unload for the person giving it. So I hear that as a good hopefully summary for what you're talking about there. Thank you for going into that. If we can, I want to pile on to this. So knowing that needs to be positive. When we talk about feedback, generally in organizations around the world, it's very common that feedback is more of a prevalent process that happens once a year during annual performance reviews. So if we can spend just a moment kind of digging into that section, what are your thoughts about the effectiveness of feedback during performance reviews? Do you find that it's a beneficial component or a detrimental component? Is there anything to do with timing around that? Like, what's your overall thoughts around that structure?
Well, I think it's pretty simple. It's fine to give feedback in a performance review, but it's not fine to not give feedback pretty much all of the time. So in other words, the performance review is just one potential place to give feedback. But if you are only saving it for the performance review, you're not going to achieve the goal of getting somebody to change, most likely. Because for a couple of reasons. The first one is that if you've saved it all, it becomes too divorced from whatever behavior you've been seeing. And that's hard for somebody, and it becomes a single conversation. And single conversations don't usually achieve feedback. A single, very charged conversation where a lot of emotion has been saved up by, especially by the giver of the feedback, who's probably seen this going on for a while, makes you as a giver not as effective. Also, if you've been saving up what you've been seeing over a year and then you give it to somebody in a single feedback session, they're going to get hit by a tsunami of stuff that's not going to feel good at all. So, my advice really is that, you need to give feedback more than just at a performance review. You need to give it often, and it shouldn't always be a boss and a employee who are giving and getting feedback. It can be many different variations. But what I would say is, what I don't agree with is that you should give feedback right after you've seen something happen, which so many people say. It's like, well, if you see someone exhibiting that behavior, you should give them that feedback. And I'm not a believer in that at all. I think you need to give feedback. Yeah, let me tell you what. Yeah. Because, again, what we're trying to do is create change in a person. And many times if you give feedback right after something happens, that person might not be ready to hear it. It may have been disturbing for that person, whatever happened. What you want to do if you want people to change is give them feedback when they're going to most likely be open to it. Now, it could be right after something happened, and maybe they're in a good mood and they're open, but usually it's not. And usually what I try to do when I give feedback is to look for an opening. I know what I want to say. I've been thinking about it. I've been thinking about how I want to frame it and position it for that person. That person comes in and have a conversation with you. Maybe it's not even about giving and getting feedback. It's just about like, let's talk about this or that. And then we're having a really good conversation. And I might say, hey, I had some thoughts about your career. And I will work it into a good conversation that we're having, because I know that person is ready to hear the feedback. I did that once with a guy who worked for me. He'd worked for me for a while. And what I'd noticed about him was that he was always holding himself back from ultimately being very successful. And we were having a great conversation about what we needed to do. And we were going on a trip to Europe, and it was this, that, and the other. And then I said, hey, I want to talk to you about your career for a minute. Do you want to talk about it right now? Does that feel good to you? He's like, yeah, let's talk about it. And I gave him this feedback, which was very deep, very deep. It wasn't negative per se, but it was asking him to think about changing, but not in a superficial way, in a deep way. And I remember him being fairly stunned about the conversation and what I was saying and what he was saying back to me, but in a way that now, years later, he has come back to me and said, that conversation we had, that really changed my life. And so when you catch someone at a point when they're ready to hear is the time that feedback's going to be accepted. And so it's kind of irrelevant if it's right after the thing that happened or, a few weeks later. What's relevant is that person ready to be open and hear it?
Yeah, I agree with you on that. I think it's important to put some context around what the thing is, what we're describing as a thing. Because if it's more of an emotional charged event, that's where we start to become more closed and defensive. So if it's a presentation, even if it's this session today, I think closer to the moment, the less we're relying on memory, which is why I agree with you. Feedback and performance reviews doesn't work at all. It is a futile effort and a waste of time and money, because all we're doing is relying on our memory and how we felt about things, whether things were overly positive or overly negative in the latest events that we remember. So it becomes a very unfair and skewed practice.
Yeah.
Yes. But I agree with you in the context of if the thing that happened is an emotional event. So if there was some conflict or somebody's anxiety was really high or whatever the case is, I think setting the stage and making that environment more open is more beneficial. Because we don't want to use that as a catalyst to create even more conflict, do we? If we can dive into, I'm going to even expand on that just a further, and we're getting some really good questions from the audience here on that. If you were to provide guidance around like how do you, like specifically, so I want to ask you really specifically, like how do you create that positive environment for people to be able to receive it well? Because it's a really good concept, but being able to infer how to ask the right questions or approach people in the right way, even if you don't have a really positive relationship, let's say, if there's impacts on that, like how would you approach somebody to make sure that it is the right time?
Yeah, I mean, the reality is you have to use some intuition, but I do want to say to all of you out there that I encourage you to think about your experiences, not giving feedback, but getting feedback as you plan how you're going to talk to somebody. Because getting feedback is probably equally, if not sometimes more difficult than giving it. And I'll tell you why. Because first of all, there's a power dynamic that goes on in feedback sessions, in most feedback sessions. What is that dynamic? It is as a manager and someone who works for them. And so being aware of this power dynamic is really important in the process of giving and getting feedback. For the person who's giving it, you many times we are not aware of how powerful we are. And
very true.
I think going into a conversation and realizing if you are the boss, that you are going to come across a lot stronger no matter how you try, because you are that person's boss, right? A lot of times when I go into a session with someone and I'm going to talk about some ideas that might require them to change, notice I'm not using the word feedback, but might require them to change if they want to take the feedback, I make sure that the person I'm talking to knows that these are suggestions and ideas and not you have tos. And I think because of this power dynamic, you need to get the best response and have people be willing to change. They need to feel a sense of control and they need to feel a sense of empowerment. And too often what I see going on is somebody telling them, this doesn't work, and it would be better if you did it this way, and it would be better if you did it that way. And all of a sudden to the employee, it starts to feel like they are losing their power and their sense of control. And when you feel like you're losing your power and sense of control, you become less apt to be open to change. It actually makes you do the opposite. It makes you shut down. And so if you can go into these conversations, not being so like, I've got it all planned out, you're not doing this right, you're not doing that right, or, you should do it this way, or this is how it's done. All of a sudden, you're playing the power dynamic in a way that isn't going to help you. The same is true if you're getting the feedback. What you need to understand as a receiver of feedback is your boss is giving you thoughts that you ultimately can choose to take or not. It is ultimately your choice whether you use the feedback or not. You are in control. You do have control when you get feedback. And just knowing that as someone who receives feedback makes it much easier to hear the feedback, because you realize I don't have to do it. I can choose to do it. Now, there will be consequences if I don't, some worse than others, but it is ultimately my decision. And I love John's story because that was a decision about an employee feeling like he had the power, right? to do whatever he wanted to do based on that feedback. And he decided ultimately he was going to leave. And I think many times people who are getting feedback, they don't realize that. And so I think as a manager, it really helps to say, hey, I'm going to tell you what I think is going to help you to be a better performer. You may choose not to do it. And that is your choice, right? But just letting people know that and letting people feel their own sense of control can be really helpful.
Do you know, I think that's really good advice. I often share with people a good way to do that really specifically is to ask follow-up questions. Because people might be, you know, coming at you with earnest intentions to mean well, and it doesn't always come across as meaning well, does it? So even as we're receiving our own feedback from others, it might put us in the defense, or maybe there's an issue with the relationship we have, or we don't fully trust the person. Whatever the case is, taking a moment to be mindful and just take a deep breath and sit with it for a moment and assume positive intent, but ask follow-up questions, not accusatory, but ask follow-up questions on whatever the feedback that you're getting to say, can you expand on what you mean? Or what was the impact you saw? If you thought my questions in the session were terrible, was there a different way I could have framed it? Should I have added some more jokes or emoted differently? You know, like being able to get more specific so you have a better understanding on what the impact is. There was an advice that was given to me quite a while ago, and it was people receive what you put out there. And I always kind of think about that sometimes. If I'm finding that somebody's reacting negatively in a way, it's easy for me to be like, oh, that's on them. That is their problem, not mine. But also, I need to check to say, well, maybe did I say something incorrectly, or did I come across too harshly? So I think all that kind of comes into play as learning to communicate with others in different manners so that it's well received.
Yeah, I really love your point, and I really think that is so true. And I think that, you know, it can be very, very challenging to get feedback, and that's why I really recommend trying to have a conversation. And what I also really recommend is when you're getting feedback, it's going to make you feel. And many times your first reaction is going to be a negative one, especially when you have that power dynamic going on. And what I love people to know about work, and what took me way too long to learn, is that the most important thing at work is building and maintaining relationships. And that is your currency and really what you can use to influence. And if it's with your boss and you're listening to your boss and you're thinking to yourself, this is making me so mad. What they're saying is so ridiculous, so off base. How dare them? I want to tell them off, or I'm going to just say I completely disagree with this. That is definitely not the way to react when you're getting feedback, even though you may feel that. And one of the hardest things to do is to just sit with it and know it's not going to happen in a single conversation as a receiver. And to know I can come back to this later. And if you're feeling really strong negative feelings as the receiver, you know, my advice always is exactly what you said, Caitlin. I loved your feedback. And then after you've listened, you've asked questions, you've listened, clarifying questions, other questions, and you're still feeling something really strong. What you want to do is acknowledge that your boss has taken time to put this together, to think about what they want to say. You do not want to say, I disagree in that meeting. If you disagree, I say, leave the meeting, go think about it, give yourself some time to cool down. Maybe your strong reaction was because it is true, which sometimes happens, right? Or maybe you're right and it isn't. But whatever you come away with, having a fight with your boss when they're giving you feedback that they've given some time to think about isn't going to help you to be more successful in that company. What's going to help you is to go away and think about it. And then when you cool down, you may want to come back and have a further conversation with your boss. You may just decide it's not worth it. You may decide you want to act on the feedback, or you may say, screw them, I'm never going to do it. I'm going to start looking for another job. But that's your decision to make. And you need to know that you can make that decision. And ultimately, you know, how you react to that feedback and making sure above all else you preserve your relationship with your boss is going to be most important. And I think people they don't get training on how to get feedback and also how to give it in many organizations. I know some of you out there probably have fantastic programs. And by the way, I'd love to link in with you, and please tell me about your programs, because I'm always interested in hearing the cool things people are doing. But I know I didn't get that opportunity as an employee. And so, I hope that you all who are listening today, if you don't have those programs going, have the opportunity to think about putting them in place, because it can really make a difference, not just how people feel about working in the company, but your ultimate productivity.
That's awesome. I thank you for expanding on that and adding the additional context to that. We are coming in closer to time, and we've got some other poll responses for topics that I want to make sure we cover. So I want to take a broader step back. Now we've talked about the interpersonal communication and maintaining relationships and things, and expand the topic of feedback a little bit broader to programmatic organizational impacts at a macro scale. So I think awesome. And where I kind of want to lean into, at least to start there, is talk a little bit about, we've talked about challenges that individuals face and anxieties they have, but talk about challenges that organizations face. So I think it resonates with all of us. I don't think it's lost in anyone. That feedback, when done really well, can be so valuable for not only individuals, but also for an organization. And it becomes immensely harder when we are figuring out how to do it well for ourselves. How do we enable this at scale across the business?
Yeah.
So I think, and please add in, June, here I'll pause a little bit, but talking through some of those challenges just at high level, and then going into how might we approach doing it really well. So I think at scale, especially in this economy, and as our worlds of work are expanding, it started with the invention of the internet, and it continues to expand the globalizations of our workforce. And we are continuously interacting with people from different cultures, different backgrounds, different viewpoints, different speaking languages where we understand each other maybe a little bit nuanced. And then, so we've got geographical cultural implications, but also these organization cultural implications. So I think that when you're looking at really implementing and sitting down and saying, okay, we want to have a really effective feedback program. The reasons might be outlining our reasons. The reasons might be we are going through a merger and acquisition. What are those business strategies? We need to scale. We need to do a cultural shift. There's ways that where we need to make sure that our employees are aligned with the growth and development, with the trajectory of our organization, to make sure that we're still maintaining ourselves as winning in the marketplace. Whatever that looks like, feedback can really facilitate that well. But I think that taking stock and really understanding, okay, what are the challenges people are going to face, not only across the whole organization, but in different pockets? What does the makeup of that look like? Some things that I've seen that that organizations have come across is really making sure that we understand what is our, and being honest with yourself, what is our hierarchical structure? Do we feel that it would be very difficult for people to give upward feedback or receive feedback from their managers, their leaders, or their superiors? What does that mean? How connected are the different business units and functional units within your organization to be able to create and facilitate more of that cross collaborative communication, we'll say? Yeah. Some organizations have a culture of nice. I've seen this lots and lots of times. I might even say that sometimes our company has the same thing in some moments. Or the opposite might be true, where it's not so much the culture of nice, but more of an individualistic culture where people are more brash. They're more forthcoming to say anecdotally or very front and center, here's what I think, here's what I want, and then we're going to move on to the next thing. And we don't wait for others to catch up. So depending on, really doing an assessment to say, are we more collective as a whole? Maybe it's different in different functional units of your organization, or are we more individualistic? And how might different areas of our organization receive that program altogether? And then taking into consideration geographical locations. So, maybe we might not have native English speakers but the heart of the headquarters of our organization is English speaking. So being able to really understand that back and forth and what are those implications, I think really important. The other part I'm going to highlight on this too, and this is a big passion of mine, is understanding more, broadening our scope of kind of understanding inclusivity as far as this concept goes, because our brains think about and perceive information that's coming in very differently all of the time. And a lot of that has to do with, at face value, what we might understand as more neurodiversity. So we could have a lot of, traumatic things that have happened in our lives, which have kind of derailed our thought processes or changed our frame of reference. But more so in really understanding, like, we want to make sure that we have, when we're implementing a program, that we have clear guidelines and a clear structure on how to do it well. We don't want to just dump a feedback program in everyone's laps and say, go to town, you have to do this. But more in understanding, like, the guardrails, setting up some very focused questions to be able to ask and answered, for example, and making sure that the structure is one that is very action-oriented, learning focused, that facilitates what June's highlighted as far as being a back and forth conversation. Does the receiver within your organization feel empowered to be able to ask follow-up questions, and how does that work? Are we providing guidance to be able to structure that effectively so everyone's on the same page as far as what the expectations are and how this goes? And I think ideally that comes back to really, really establishing a system of accountability within the organization. So if I'm out there on my own and feedback's brand new and I'm getting it left and right and it's really hurting my feelings, I need to make sure that, managers, or at least my manager, is having a conversation with me about it to say, hey, how are you receiving the feedback that you've gotten? Or as a manager myself, doing that with my direct reports. I know that you've had a few conversations with a project you just closed out, or a deliverable that you've had, or I noticed, or I heard that there was a conflict you might have encountered. How did that go? How did you receive it? What were the discussion points? And really enabling our managers to care about those conversations that people have. Otherwise, it could fester and build up a lot of anxieties and pain points within people. So I think going gentle into that good night is one of my favorite quotes for a program like this, where we start off really simple and really easy. We make sure that we attach it to some KPIs, development progress. Maybe the focus is just on people's development goals to start with, but we start really simple and really easy, and then scale and broaden what that looks like from there.